The moment my son-in-law called me a stubborn old fool at my own dining room table, I set down my fork, looked him in the eye, and smiled. That smile terrified him. He just didn't know it yet. Let me back up a little. My name is Warren. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate business from the ground up. Not inherited money, not lucky timing, just early mornings and late nights and a lot of handshake deals that I made sure to follow up with airtight paperwork. My wife Helen was my partner in everything until she passed away from a stroke 4 years ago. After she was gone, I sold the main business, but held on to 3 rental properties and a self-storage facility outside of Raleigh. Not flashy, not a fortune by any Wall Street standard, but enough that certain people started paying very close attention to how much longer I intended to keep breathing. My daughter, my only child, married a man named Travis when she was 28. I tried. I genuinely tried to like him. He had a firm handshake and a smooth way of talking that I recognized immediately from years of sitting across the table from men who wanted something from me. But she loved him, and Helen always said I was too suspicious of people, so I kept my reservations to myself. I walked her down the aisle. I gave a toast that made people cry. I meant every word of it. The first few years were fine. They visited on holidays. We talked on the phone. Travis sold insurance and seemed to do reasonably well. My daughter taught 3rd grade and was happy, or at least she seemed happy. I didn't ask too many questions. A father learns eventually that some doors are not his to open. Then Helen died, and something shifted. I don't know if it was grief that lowered my defenses, or if Travis simply sensed an opening, but within 6 months of the funeral, the conversation started changing. Little comments about the properties, questions about what I planned to do with them eventually. A suggestion floated casually over Thanksgiving dinner that it might make more financial sense for me to sell the self-storage facility and put the money somewhere more liquid. I told him I'd think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. By the following spring, Travis had begun positioning himself as my helper. He offered to review my insurance policies. He volunteered to drive me to appointments when I didn't need driving. He started calling me Dad for the first time in 15 years of marriage, which my daughter seemed touched by and which made the back of my neck go cold. I want to be clear about something. I was not a confused old man. I did not have early dementia. I was not isolated or vulnerable in the ways that elder financial abuse cases typically describe. I jogged 3 miles every other morning. I read 2 newspapers. I managed my own portfolio and had a sharper memory for numbers than most men half my age. But I was alone, and Travis knew that loneliness has a way of making even careful people let their guard down. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening in March. Travis called me, not my daughter Travis, and told me that his parents were in serious financial trouble. His father had medical debt. His mother's car had been repossessed. They were 3 months behind on rent in their apartment in Charlotte, and the landlord was threatening eviction. Travis said the only solution he could see was for them to move in with him and my daughter, but their house was too small. Then there was a long pause on the phone. "Your place has that whole unused wing," he said. "3 bedrooms just sitting empty." I told him I'd think about it. "Dad," he said, and the word landed differently this time, like a hand on a shoulder that applies just slightly more pressure than warmth. "Family takes care of family." I told him I'd think about it. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my legal affairs for 22 years. I told her everything. The shift in Travis's behavior since Helen's death, the questions about the properties, the request about his parents, the feeling I couldn't shake that something was being built around me that I couldn't see the full shape of yet. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Warren, you're not being paranoid, you're being smart. Let's make sure you stay that way." That night I started doing something I had never done before. I started keeping records. Every phone call, I noted the date, the time, what was said. I invested in a small digital recorder that I carried in my shirt pocket. Not illegal in North Carolina, which is a one-party consent state, meaning I only needed my own consent to record a conversation I was part of. I didn't tell anyone, I just listened and recorded and waited. My daughter called 2 days later to follow up on the housing situation. The conversation was gentle, loving even, but I could hear the shape of Travis behind the words. She mentioned his parents 3 times. She mentioned that I seemed isolated out there. She said she worried about me rattling around in that big house alone. I told her I was fine. I asked about her students. I listened to her laugh, and for a moment, I forgot to be afraid of what was happening. Over the next 3 months, the pressure built in layers. Travis started sending me articles about aging in place and fall risks in large homes. He forwarded me a link to a financial advisor, someone I didn't know, someone he knew, and suggested a fresh set of eyes on my portfolio. He mentioned twice in passing that a friend of his had helped his own father set up a living trust that really simplified everything. I smiled and nodded and recorded every word. Then came Easter Sunday. My daughter and Travis drove up from Raleigh. They brought his parents, Gerald and Shirley, who I had met only a handful of times at the wedding and a subsequent Christmas, and I had not been told in advance that his parents will be coming. They simply arrived, the 4 of them, with a pan of store-bought rolls and a bottle of wine, as if this had always been the plan. I fed them all. I was gracious. I asked Gerald about his health and Shirley about her garden, and I watched Travis watching me the entire meal, measuring something. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and his parents were settled in the living room like they already lived there, Travis poured fresh glasses of wine and said it was time to have a real talk. I knew what was coming. I had known since they walked through the door. He laid it out plainly. His parents needed a stable place to live. My house had space. The arrangement would be temporary, 6 months maximum, after which they would figure something more permanent out in exchange. And here he smiled at me, that insurance salesman smile. He would help me manage my properties, take some of the burden off, handle the leases, the maintenance calls, the tenant communications. You shouldn't be dealing with all that stress at your age, Dad. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter, who was watching her wine glass. I looked at Gerald and Shirley, who were pretending to be absorbed in a conversation of their own on the other side of the room. I said no. Not angrily, not emotionally. I simply said that my home was my home, that I had given the request serious consideration over the past several weeks, and that the answer was no. Travis's face changed. It happened fast, just a flicker, but I had been watching for it. "You're being selfish," he said. "These are real people in a real crisis," he said. "Helen would have never turned family away," he said. "That last one was meant to land like a punch, and I'll admit it did." I felt it in my chest, but I kept my face still. My daughter started crying quietly, which nearly broke me. I reached across and put my hand over hers and told her I loved her. Travis stood up sharply, and in the motion he knocked his wine glass off the table. It wasn't entirely accidental. I had watched enough conflict in 30 years of business negotiations to know the difference between a clumsy accident and a gesture of frustration, but it shattered on the tile floor and the red wine splashed across my slacks and my shoe. He looked at the mess for a moment and then looked at me. "I think we're done here," I said. I walked calmly to the garage, got in my car, drove to the urgent care clinic on Highway 70, and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes. Then I went inside and had a nurse document a small laceration on my ankle from a shard of glass. Minor. barely needed a bandage. But documented. Then I sat in my car again and called Patricia. Phase 1, I said, is complete. Patricia's response was dry and immediate. About time. I've been sitting on 3 things you're going to want to hear. Over the following 6 weeks, I learned exactly what had been building around me. Travis had consulted, twice, with a different attorney in Wake County about the process for establishing a guardianship over an aging parent based on cognitive decline. He had not filed anything. He was shopping. Patricia had a contact entirely above board. We heard his name in the right circles. She was careful about how she told me this, but the message was clear. Travis was exploring whether he could get a court to declare me incompetent. He had also made 2 phone calls to my bank, posing once as my representative, and once, more alarmingly, as me, attempting to get information about the structure of my accounts. The bank flagged the second call. I now had a formal incident report on file. And Patricia had drafted at my direction and over the past several months a comprehensive irrevocable trust covering all 3 rental properties in the storage facility. The trust named a professional trustee, a fiduciary firm in Raleigh, not Travis, not my daughter, not anyone he could influence. The transfer had been completed and recorded. Legally, those assets were no longer mine to give away and not his to take. I want to say something here for anyone listening who might be in a similar situation, because this part matters. I did not do any of this out of anger. I did it out of clarity. There is a difference. Anger is reactive. Clarity is protective. I protected myself the same way I had protected my business for 3 decades, methodically, quietly, and several moves ahead. Travis did not let it go. In June, he filed a petition in Wake County District Court requesting that I be placed under a limited guardianship, citing what he described as concerning behavioral changes and inability to manage complex financial affairs. He attached a letter from a physician, a doctor I had never met and never been a patient of, whose name I did not recognize, stating that I showed signs consistent with early cognitive impairment. When Patricia showed me the filing, I read it twice. Then I laughed. Not because it wasn't serious. It was. But because I had been keeping records for 4 months. Because I had audio. Because I had my actual physician, Dr. Redlett, Caldwell at Wake Forest Baptist, who had seen me 6 weeks prior and documented a full cognitive screening in which I scored in the 91st percentile for my age group. Because I had the bank's incident report about Travis's fraudulent phone calls. Because I had a private investigator's report, something Patricia had quietly arranged, showing that the physician who signed Travis's letter had lost his license to practice in 2 states and was operating on a provisional basis in North Carolina. The guardianship petition died in 11 days. The judge didn't even call a full hearing. He reviewed the counterfilings, looked at Travis's supporting documentation against mine, and dismissed it. 2 weeks later, Travis was contacted by the Wake County District Attorney's Office regarding the fraudulent phone calls to my bank. Impersonating an account holder to obtain financial information is a Class H felony in North Carolina. I did not call the DA. The bank did. I simply made sure the incident report was preserved. My daughter called me the night Travis was formally charged. She was crying again, but differently this time. She said she hadn't known about the doctor's letter. She said she hadn't known about the phone calls to the bank. She said she hadn't known about the phone calls to the bank. She said she had thought, genuinely thought, that she was trying to help me. I believed her. I still believe her. My daughter is not a bad person. She is a woman who loved a man who turned out to be one, and that is a different thing entirely. We talked for 2 hours that night. I did not yell. I did not say I told you so. I told her that I had been scared too, not of getting old, but of what it meant that someone who sat at my wife's funeral could look at the space Helen left behind and see opportunity. I told her that I needed her to see clearly now, even if it was painful. She cried some more. I let her. Travis pled no contest to a reduced charge and was placed on supervised probation. He and my daughter separated 4 months later. I did not encourage that. I did not discourage it. It was her life and her choice, and I told her that whatever she decided, I would be standing on the same piece of ground I had always been standing on. His parents, Gerald and Shirley, had quietly returned to Charlotte sometime in July and never addressed him directly. There was nothing to address. They were passengers. In September, my daughter helped me repaint Helen's garden room, which had been sitting untouched since the funeral. We worked for 2 days, just the two of us, with a radio on and takeout containers from a Vietnamese place in Cary that Helen had loved. My daughter found one of Helen's old seed catalogs tucked behind a shelf, and she held it for a long time without saying anything. I put my arm around her, and we stood there in a room that smelled like fresh paint and old grief, and something just beginning to be all right again. The following spring, I planted tomatoes. The self-storage facility turned a 14% increase in net revenue that year. My rental properties are fully occupied. My attorney Patricia sends me a Christmas card every year with a handwritten note at the bottom. Last year it said, "Stay sharp, Warren. The world needs more of you." I intend to. There's a thing I noticed. Sitting in that urgent care parking lot on Highway 70 with a bandaged ankle and a phone in my hand. The world didn't feel like it had just fallen apart. It felt for the first time in months like it was exactly where I could see it. That's what people don't tell you about being wronged by someone you loved and trusted. The hardest part isn't the betrayal itself, it's the period before it. When you sense something is wrong, but you keep telling yourself you're imagining it. Because the alternative, that this person has been calculating against you for years, is too painful to sit with. I almost let that politeness, that fatherly reluctance to cause friction, cost me everything. Helen and I built together. Travis counted on that. He counted on the fact that a grieving man in his late 60s would rather keep the peace than make an accusation. And he was almost right. What stopped him wasn't luck. It was a choice I made, quietly, without announcing it, to treat my own life with the same rigor I had always brought to business. To document. To consult people smarter than me in their specific fields. To stay clear-eyed about what was actually happening rather than what I wished were happening. Intelligence, real practical intelligence, isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about knowing which room to walk into and who to listen to when you get there. Patricia knew things I didn't know. The fiduciary firm knew things Patricia didn't. I was wise enough to find them and honest enough with myself to take their counsel seriously. And then there was the matter of simply not breaking. There were nights in those months, after Travis filed that petition, after I read a stranger doctor's name attached to a lie about my own mind, when I sat in Helen's garden room and felt something I can only describe as a kind of quiet fury mixed with grief. Not rage, not despair, something steadier and colder than either. I didn't let it make me reckless. I let it make me precise. That's what endurance actually looks like when you're 67 and someone is trying to reclassify your competence in a court filing. It doesn't look heroic. It looks like getting up the next morning and making coffee and calling your attorney at 8 a.m. and doing the next right thing. My daughter's rebuilding her life now. She came over last fall with a flat of seedlings she'd picked up at the farmer's market, and we spent a Saturday putting them in along the back fence where Helen used to grow her cutting flowers. She didn't say much. Neither did I, but there was a quality to the silence that felt different from the silences we'd been living in, and I was grateful for it. What happened to Travis was the direct result of his own choices. Nobody manufactured his downfall. He made fraudulent phone calls to a bank. He attached a discredited physician's letter to a legal filing. He built an entire structure on the assumption that I was too old, too sad, and too soft to notice. Every one of those decisions carried a consequence that arrived in its own time, with no intervention from me beyond simply preserving the truth of what occurred. That's the thing about acting with integrity over a long stretch of time. It doesn't always protect you from being targeted, but it means that when someone builds a case against you out of fabricated evidence, the real record stands in plain contrast, and judges, DA offices, and decent people generally know the difference. I planted those tomatoes in April. They came in heavy by August. I gave most of them away.